On a rainy day in Texas, nobody expected tragedy. One teenager would lose his life, another would face a murder charge, and a single moment would spark years of controversy, courtroom battles, and national debate. April 2nd, 2025. The city of Frisco, Texas was hosting a district track and field competition involving multiple local high schools. Students from different schools gathered at a Frisco Independent School District stadium to compete throughout the day. Rain had become a problem. As showers moved through the area, many students sought shelter beneath tents set up for their respective schools. Among those attending was 17-year-old Austin Metcalf, a student at Memorial High School. Also present was Carmelo Anthony, a student from Centennial High School. According to testimony later presented in court, the two teenagers had never been close friends. On that day, however, their paths crossed beneath a school tent during the rain. What happened next would become the center of a murder trial watched across the country. Witnesses later testified that an argument developed after Anthony was standing or sitting beneath Memorial High School's tent area. Several students reportedly told him he needed to leave. According to testimony, the confrontation continued for several minutes. Some witnesses later claimed Anthony was asked to leave numerous times. Others described increasing tension between the two teenagers. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a verbal disagreement. But witnesses would later describe the situation becoming increasingly hostile. And then, everything changed. The exact sequence of events became one of the most heavily debated issues during the trial. Multiple student witnesses offered descriptions of what they saw. Some testified that Austin Metcalf pushed Anthony. Others described the contact differently. What was not disputed was that physical contact occurred. The prosecution argued that the confrontation never justified deadly force. The defense argued that Anthony reacted out of fear during a chaotic situation. The argument lasted only minutes, yet those few minutes would determine the future of everyone involved. Suddenly, a knife appeared. Within moments, Austin Metcalf suffered a stab wound to the chest. Shock spread across the stadium. Students began screaming. Teachers and coaches rushed toward the scene. What had begun as an argument between teenagers had transformed into a life-or-death emergency in front of dozens of witnesses. No one expected a school track meet to become a homicide investigation. But that's exactly what happened. As chaos erupted beneath the stadium tent, coaches, trainers, and emergency personnel rushed toward Austin Metcalf. Witnesses later described a scene of panic and disbelief. Students who had arrived expecting a normal athletic competition suddenly found themselves watching a medical emergency unfold in front of them. A football coach immediately began trying to stop the bleeding. An athletic trainer performed life-saving measures while waiting for paramedics. Around them, students stood frozen in shock. Many were crying. Others couldn't fully understand what had just happened. According to testimony, Austin was eventually transported to a nearby hospital. Despite the efforts of medical personnel, he did not survive. News of his death spread rapidly throughout the community. For classmates and teachers, the loss felt impossible to process. A school sporting event had become the scene of a homicide investigation. Meanwhile, investigators began collecting evidence. Witnesses were interviewed. Videos were reviewed. A knife believed to be involved in the incident was recovered. Every detail would later become critical during the criminal case that followed. Within hours, the tragedy that had shaken one stadium became a story drawing attention across Texas. And eventually, across the entire country. As investigators worked to establish what happened, prosecutors focused on one central argument. They believed the stabbing was not justified. According to the prosecution, the confrontation never reached a level that would legally justify deadly force. The state argued that the defendant had opportunities to walk away. They claimed the response was completely disproportionate to the situation. Defense attorneys saw the incident differently. They argued that their client believed he was in danger. According to the defense, the confrontation escalated quickly and created fear, confusion, and panic. Their argument centered on self-defense. The question was simple. Did Anthony intentionally commit murder? Or did he react during a moment when he genuinely believed he needed to protect himself? That question would become the focus of a trial watched closely by thousands of people. More than a year after the stabbing, jurors gathered inside a Texas courtroom. Security around the courthouse was unusually high. Public interest in the case had grown significantly. Supporters of both families attended hearings. Outside the courthouse, emotions often ran high. Inside, jurors listened to testimony from students who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand. Many described the argument that took place beneath the tent. Several testified that physical contact occurred before the stabbing. However, witnesses did not always describe the event in exactly the same way. Some remembered a stronger push. Others described something less aggressive. Jurors also heard from investigators, medical experts, coaches, and school personnel. One of the most important pieces of testimony came from the medical examiner. According to evidence presented in court, the stab wound entered Austin's chest and caused catastrophic internal damage. The injury proved fatal. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of events. Attorneys argued that fear and split-second decision-making played a major role in what happened. Throughout the trial, jurors were asked to examine every second of the confrontation. Every statement, every witness, every action. Because the final verdict would depend on how they interpreted those moments. After days of testimony, both sides delivered their final arguments. Prosecutors described the stabbing as an unjustified act of violence. They argued that being pushed did not legally justify using deadly force. The defense urged jurors to consider the defendant's perspective during the confrontation. They argued that decisions made during moments of fear are not always rational. Both sides asked jurors to reach very different conclusions. The responsibility now rested entirely with the jury. For the families involved, the waiting was unbearable. Months of preparation. Years of grief. Everything now depended on the deliberations of 12 strangers. The jury began deliberating. For hours, they reviewed evidence, testimony, and legal instructions. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The jury found Carmelo Anthony guilty of murder. The courtroom reaction was emotional. For Austin Metcalf's family, the verdict represented accountability for the loss of their son. For Anthony and his supporters, it marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with uncertainty. But the proceedings were not over. The jury still had to determine punishment. And the decision would shape the remainder of Anthony's life. During the sentencing phase, family members addressed the court. The emotional statements revealed the devastating impact Austin's death had on those closest to him. His parents spoke about the future that had been taken away. A future filled with milestones, achievements, and memories that would never happen. The courtroom listened as grief, heartbreak, and frustration were expressed in deeply personal terms. Anthony's mother also addressed the court. She asked jurors for mercy and described her son's remorse. Both families now faced consequences that could never be reversed. After additional deliberations, the jury reached a decision. 35 years in prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the conviction, while ending one of the most closely watched trials in Texas. As the case moved toward appeals and future legal proceedings, one reality remained unchanged. A young life had been lost. Another young life would now be spent behind prison walls, and two families would continue living with the consequences of a tragedy that began during what should have been an ordinary day at a high school track meet. Cases like this often generate intense debate. People may disagree about responsibility, self-defense, or the fairness of a verdict. But beyond the arguments and headlines are real families whose lives were permanently altered. As always, we encourage respectful discussion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries based on real court records and verified reporting, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next case.